The band was playing something slow with too much brass in it, and Josie Marsh had her hand fisted in the front of my shirt like she was deciding whether to kiss me or shove me into the lake, and for a solid 3 seconds I genuinely couldn't tell which one she'd pick. String lights sagged between the porch posts behind her, throwing gold across her face, and past her shoulder I could see her mother watching us with a glass of champagne frozen halfway to her mouth. 40 feet away, Preston Kessler stood in a tuxedo that probably cost more than my car, not dancing, just watching, the way a man watches something he still thinks belongs to him. Josie's fingers tightened in my shirt. Her voice, when it finally came, wasn't loud enough for anyone but me. "Kiss me like you mean it." Not a question, not really a request either. I felt her breath on my jaw, and every rehearsed answer I'd prepared for this week went straight out of my head. 6 days earlier, none of this had been real. 6 days earlier, I hadn't known Preston Kessler existed, and the only ring on Josie's finger had been a plastic one from a gumball machine that she kept on her desk to hold her hair back while she painted. 6 days earlier, I was just the guy who split rent with her, who ate her leftover Thai food without asking, who had spent about 1.5 years quietly in love with a woman who mostly thought of me as furniture that occasionally drove her to urgent care. That's the part nobody warns you about, falling for your roommate. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in the unglamorous moments, her laugh through a shared wall, the half-finished mugs of tea she leaves around the apartment like breadcrumbs, the night she fell asleep on my shoulder during a documentary about deep-sea fish, and I didn't move for 2 hours because I didn't want it to end. I'd made peace with never telling her any of that. Then her sister decided to get married in 6 days, and Josie burst into our kitchen, looking like she'd seen a ghost, and every bit of that peace fell apart on the spot. My name is Caleb Ford. I'm 29. I work as a paramedic out of a station 20 minutes from our apartment, and most days that job means I'm the calmest person in a room that's actively on fire. None of it prepared me for Josie standing in the kitchen at 7 in the morning, still in the shirt she'd slept in, holding her phone like it had personally betrayed her. Say that again. I needed a second to catch up, even though I'd heard her the first time. My mother thinks I have a fiancé. She set the phone down like it was hot. I told her back in February. I was having a bad week. She was doing the thing where she asks if I'm doing okay in the voice that means she already thinks the answer's no, and I panicked and told her I was seeing someone. Seriously seeing someone. She held up the phone, the screen still lit with a text thread I could read just enough of to catch the words "Bring him Friday" in bold. Then Claire got engaged, the wedding got moved up, and now she wants to meet him. I did not laugh, because nothing about Josie's face suggested this was a laughing situation. But I did feel a specific kind of vertigo, the kind where the floor doesn't move, and everything you thought you understood about the next 6 days does. So there's no boyfriend. And an Indian boyfriend. There's a lie I told to get my mother to stop looking at me like a failed experiment, and it's been sitting there quietly, not being a problem for 5 months, and now it has an RSVP deadline. Eleanor Marsh isn't a cruel woman. She's not the kind who says the quiet part out loud. She's the kind who says, "I just want you to be settled," in a tone that somehow implies you've disappointed several generations of ancestors by choosing freelance illustration over anything with health insurance. And she'd spent 2 years quietly hoping Josie would patch things up with Preston Kessler, whose family's beverage distribution company had, not coincidentally, been the only serious offer on the table when Josie's father's cider orchard went underwater after a bad frost 2 winters back. Nobody in that family had ever said the word arrangement out loud. Nobody had to. Josie had grown up watching her father go quiet every time Kessler brothers came up at dinner, and she'd spent 2 years feeling like the only thing standing between him losing the orchard and keeping it was whether she smiled at Preston at the right family function. "So don't go," I said, because it seemed obvious. "It's Claire's wedding. She's my sister. I have to go, and if I show up alone, my mother's going to spend the whole weekend engineering alone time with Preston, like she's running a covert operation, and my dad's going to sit there hoping I'll fix everything by falling for the guy whose family might save his business, and I can't. Her voice cracked in a way I'd never once heard it crack, not in a year and a half of watching her handle everything life threw at her with this stubborn, quiet competence that made you forget she was allowed to be scared too. I can't do 6 days of that alone. She looked at me like she was doing math she didn't want to be doing. You're a paramedic. You're good at staying calm when things are on fire. And you're you. You'd be good at this. At what, exactly? Pretending to be my fiancé for a week. The kitchen went very quiet. Down the hall, our upstairs neighbor's dog started barking at nothing, same as it did every morning at exactly this time. And I remember thinking I now had 6 days to either save this woman from her own family or ruin the best friendship I'd ever had, and possibly both. I said yes before I let myself think too hard about why. We spent that night at the kitchen table building a relationship out of nothing, the way you'd assemble furniture from a kit missing half its instructions. We'd met 2 years ago. That part was true. We'd just skip the part where it was a Craigslist ad for the second bedroom, and not, as we'd now be telling her family, a mutual friend's barbecue. I'd proposed at the little Italian place on Ferry Street, the one with the crooked awning, because it was the only restaurant either of us could describe in detail. The ring. Josie produced this from a drawer with the triumphant air of someone who'd clearly been planning it longer than she was admitting, was her grandmother's, small and a little loose on her finger, which she said would explain itself if anyone asked why it kept sliding around. We ran the story until it stopped sounding like a story and started sounding like something we'd actually lived through, and somewhere around midnight, deep into a debate over whether I'd proposed on a Tuesday or a Thursday, I caught myself laughing so hard at her impression of her own mother that I forgot. For a few full minutes, none of it was real. Somewhere around 1 a.m, Josie set down the legal pad she'd apparently been using to track our fake history and announced we needed rules. Hand-holding was fine, expected even, but nothing that would embarrass either of us if it turned out to mean nothing later. No pet names, because if I called her babe in front of her mother, she would end me on the spot, she said. And she meant it in the specific way people mean things at 1 a.m. after 4 hours of building a relationship out of index cards. Kissing was reserved for genuine emergencies only, defined loosely as anyone looking directly at us for longer than 3 seconds with visible suspicion. I told her that sounded less like a rule and more like a very specific dare, and she threw a couch pillow at my head hard enough that I felt it the next morning. I'm serious, Caleb. I know you're serious. I'm agreeing with the rule. I'm just saying, statistically, my mother stares at people for longer than 3 seconds constantly, so this could get complicated fast. Your mother isn't at this wedding. No, but yours apparently invented the 3-second stare, so I'm just setting expectations. She'd almost smiled at that, the real one, the one that made her nose scrunch, before catching herself and going back to the legal pad like ground rules for pretend love were a serious administrative matter, which, I suppose, to her they were. That should have worried me more than it did. Josie has this way of tucking her knees up onto chairs like she's perpetually cold, and a permanent smudge of ink on the side of her right hand from years of holding a pencil at the wrong angle, and a small chip in her front tooth from a bike accident when she was 9 that she's, for reasons I've never understood, deeply self-conscious about. I know these things because I live with her, not because I was looking for reasons to notice them, though I'd noticed plenty. We drove up to Cedar Lake Thursday afternoon, 4 hours of 2-lane highway and gas station coffee, and somewhere around hour 2, she turned the radio down and asked, out of nowhere, if I'd ever actually been in love with anyone. I said something deflecting and stupid about paramedics not having time for that, and she let it go, because that was always the deal. She didn't push, and I didn't tell her the truth, which was that I had, in fact, been in love with someone for about 1.5 years, and that someone was currently riding shotgun with a fake engagement ring loose on her finger, working through a bag of gas station sour candy like it was a personality trait. The lake house came into view around 6, white clapboard with a porch that wrapped the whole front of it, the kind of house that photographs well for a wedding website. Josie's hand found mine on the console without either of us deciding it should. "Last chance to back out," she said. "You already bought the ring." "It's my grandmother's ring." "Then I really can't back out. Your grandmother would haunt me." That got the first real laugh out of her all day, the kind that made her nose scrunch up, and I filed it away the way I'd apparently been filing away every small thing about her for 2 years without admitting that's what I was doing. Eleanor Marsh met us on the porch before we'd even gotten the car doors shut, which I'd later learn was less a coincidence and more a woman who'd been watching the driveway for 40 minutes. She had Josie's same sharp cheekbones aged into something more severe, a cardigan that cost about what I made in a week, and a smile that didn't reach anywhere near her eyes when they landed on me. So this is him, not a question, apparently that ran in the family too. Caleb Ford. I put my hand out, and she looked at it just long enough to make the gesture feel like a mistake before she shook it. "Eleanor, I've heard so little about you I started wondering if Josephine made you up." "Mom, we've been together 2 years. Josie's voice had that particular tightness I recognized from every phone call she'd ever taken on speaker. Eleanor's eyes did a slow pass over me, my off-brand sneakers, the rental car, the button-down I'd worn instead of whatever she considered acceptable. And I understood, in that single sweep, that I'd already failed tests I hadn't known I was taking. Walter Marsh saved us, coming around the side of the house in work boots with sawdust on his forearms, and the second he saw Josie, his whole face cracked open into something warm and real. "There's my girl." He hugged her hard enough to lift her clean off the porch boards, and when he turned to me, his handshake was the opposite of his wife's, firm and unbothered, a man sizing up another man the honest way. "So you're the one keeping her out of trouble." "Mostly failing at that, sir. But I try." That got a real laugh out of him, loud and surprised, and I saw Eleanor's mouth thin like she'd been hoping I wouldn't be likable. Claire came barreling out next, barefoot and glowing with the specific chaos of a bride 4 days out, and pulled Josie into a hug that knocked them both sideways, talking a mile a minute about seating charts and a florist emergency. And had Josie seen Simon yet? He'd been rehearsing his vows in the bathroom mirror for 2 days straight, and it was going to be a disaster, in the good way. I liked Claire immediately, the way you like people who've never learned to perform for a room. It was on the walk up to the house, bags in hand, that I first saw him, Preston Kessler, unfolding himself from a deck chair, with the unhurried confidence of a man who'd never once worried a room might not want him in it. He was better looking than I wanted him to be, tan in a way that suggested actual vacations rather than a job that kept him outside, and his eyes went straight to the ring on Josie's hand before they ever reached her face. Josie Marsh, like her name was something he was fond of. "It's been a while." "Preston." Her voice had gone carefully flat. "This is Caleb." His handshake was firm, a beat too long, his eyes doing their own slow inventory of me. Less about my sneakers, more like he was running numbers. "Fiancé," he said, testing the word. "Eleanor mentioned it. Congratulations." He didn't sound congratulatory. He sounded like a man reading a competitor's earnings report. Dinner that night was on the long table under the porch lights, 12 people deep, and I spent the first 20 minutes doing math on which fork mattered before I noticed Josie doing the exact same thing and felt marginally better about myself. It was Eleanor who set the trap, halfway through the fish course, asking brightly how exactly Caleb had proposed, since Josephine had been so vague about the details on the phone. Josie went rigid beside me. We'd practiced this. Tuesday, the Italian place. the crooked awning. My mouth opened to deliver it, and what came out instead, for reasons I'll blame entirely on nerves, was, actually it was a Thursday. Josie's fork paused an inch above her plate. It was a Tuesday. I'm almost positive it was a Thursday, because you'd had a deadline that day, and you were covered in ink, and you told me if I was going to do this, I had exactly 4 minutes, because you had a client call, and I remember thinking, this woman is going to make me propose on a schedule for the rest of my life, and somehow that made me want to do it more. The table laughed, actually laughed, Claire clapping a hand over her mouth, and I felt Josie exhale beside me, some of the tension draining out of her shoulders. Under the table, her hand found my knee and squeezed once, a silent thank you for the save, except I hadn't been saving anything. I'd been describing a memory that had never happened but somehow felt like it had, because I'd pictured this woman covered in ink 100 times without ever needing an excuse. Preston, across the table, wasn't laughing. 4 minutes, he said, swirling his wine. Impressive, getting a woman to say yes that fast. Took me 8 months just to land a second date. Preston, Eleanor's voice carried a warning even she seemed to know wouldn't land. I'm just saying, Josie's not exactly an easy yes. His eyes found mine, something sharp underneath the smile. You must have really sold it. I could have let that go. I've handled worse than a rich man's ego over dinner. But something about the way he'd said sold it, like Josie was a property he'd lost a bid on, tightened my jaw in a way that had nothing to do with pretending. I didn't sell anything, I said, keeping my voice easy, the same one I use on scared patients. I just paid attention. Turns out that's most of it. The table went quiet the specific way tables go quiet when something true gets said out loud by accident. Josie turned to look at me, and for a second the performance dropped clean off both our faces, and it was just us, looking at each other across a plate of lake trout like the last 4 days hadn't been rehearsed at all. Mara, Josie's best friend, wedged in near the far end of the table between 2 Kessler cousins, caught my eye over her wine glass, and gave me the smallest, most knowing eyebrow raise I've ever seen a human being deploy, and I understood immediately I had not been nearly as subtle as I thought I'd been for the last year and a half. Everyone else went to bed around 11, worn out from travel and family, and I found Josie on the porch swing at midnight, wrapped in a blanket that had clearly lived on that porch since before either of us were born, staring out at the black stretch of the lake. I sat down without asking, and the swing creaked under both our weight. You okay? My mother asked me tonight, very casually, whether I'd thought any more about the orchard. She pulled the blanket tighter, like I hadn't just introduced her to my fiancé 3 hours ago. Like the whole reason you're sitting on this porch isn't currently in that conversation with her. What'd you say? I said I hadn't thought about it, because thinking about it makes me want to throw up. Because if I actually let myself add it up, my dad losing the one thing he built with his own hands because his daughter picked drawing pictures over marrying into money, I don't know how I keep getting out of bed some mornings. She said this looking straight ahead, not at me, in the tone people use when the only way to say something true is to say it to the lake instead of to a person. Nobody's ever said it to me out loud like that it's my fault. It's not your fault. You don't know that. I know your dad would rather lose 10 orchards than watch you marry someone to save one. That got her to look at me, finally. Something raw and unguarded in her face I didn't see often, because Josie Marsh does not do unguarded. Not with me, not with anyone I'd ever seen. How do you know what my dad would rather do? Because I watched his face tonight every time you laughed at something I said. That's not a man doing math about a business deal. That's a man who's happy his kid found somebody. The porch light buzzed overhead, moths knocking against the glass, and neither of us said anything for a long moment. She didn't say anything, neither did I. We just sat there, the swing barely moving, close enough that I could feel the warmth coming off her under the blanket, and I thought about a year and a half of nights just like this one, minus the excuse of an engagement to explain why I couldn't stop looking at her. "Can I ask you something?" she said, "and you have to actually answer, not do the thing where you make a joke and change the subject." That's a very specific accusation. It's an accurate one. I looked at her for a second, weighing it, and something about the dark and the lake and 4 days of pretending to be a version of myself who got to say true things out loud made me say, "Okay, ask. That thing at dinner about paying attention, was that us? Or was that," she gestured vaguely between us, "the blanket, the porch, the fake part talking?" The honest answer sat right there in my chest, 4 days from being said, a year and a half in the making, and I opened my mouth to say it. And that was the exact moment Eleanor's voice cut through the screen door behind us, sharp and bright and utterly ruinous. "There you two are. Josephine, can I borrow your fiancé for a moment? Alone?" Eleanor walked me down to the dock without waiting to see if I'd follow, and I went, because refusing felt like it would confirm whatever she already suspected. She stood with her arms crossed, looking out at the water instead of at me, and when she finally spoke, her voice had lost the bright hostess polish from dinner. "How long have you actually known my daughter?" 2 years. That wasn't my question. She turned, and for the first time all weekend I saw something underneath the appraisal. Not just judgment, but fear. The specific fear of a mother who thinks she's the only one holding her family together. I've watched Josephine her whole life talk herself out of good things because she doesn't think she deserves them. I've also watched her lie to me exactly once, badly, back in February, over the phone, in a voice I know better than my own. So I'll ask again, and I'd like the truth. How long has this actually been real? I could have kept the story going. We'd built it well enough to survive a dinner table. It might have survived her mother too, if I'd wanted it to. But something about the word real, coming from the one person who apparently already suspected it wasn't, made the whole thing suddenly exhausting to keep carrying. "I've known her 2 years, I said carefully. "The engagement is 4 days old." Eleanor didn't look surprised, which told me she'd already known, or at least guessed, for a while. Why? Because she was scared of coming here alone and being pushed at a man she doesn't want, to save a business her father would rather lose than watch her sacrifice herself for. And because I've been in love with her for about a year and a half, and this was the first excuse I've ever had to hold her hand in public, so I said yes before I let myself think about whether it was smart. That landed somewhere I hadn't expected. Eleanor's arms uncrossed. For a second, she looked less like a woman running a wedding weekend, and more like somebody's tired mother, standing alone on a dock in the dark. "The orchard," she said quietly, "was never supposed to be Josephine's responsibility. Does she know that?" I don't know what I've let her believe. Behind us, up at the house, a door slammed, and we both turned in time to see Preston coming down the porch steps 2 at a time, jaw tight, heading straight for the dock, like a man who just watched something through a window he didn't like. "Josie's looking for you," he said, not bothering to hide the edge in it. "Rehearsal's starting early tomorrow. You might want to go handle that." It wasn't a suggestion so much as a dismissal, and walking back up toward the house I understood that whatever peace I'd just made with Eleanor, I had roughly 18 hours left before the wedding, and at least one more person determined to make sure this week ended exactly the way he wanted it to. The morning of the wedding, I found Josie in the guest room fighting with the zipper on her bridesmaid dress, twisting in front of the mirror, trying to reach a spot between her shoulder blades that human arms aren't built to reach. "Don't laugh. I'm not laughing. You're laughing on the inside. I can hear it." I crossed the room and took over the zipper, and for a second neither of us said anything, my knuckles brushing the back of her neck, her breath going a little uneven under my hands. Nervous, terrified. Not about Claire. Claire's going to be fine. Claire's been ready for this since she was 12. I'm terrified Preston's going to corner me at the photos, or my mother's going to make some comment during the toasts, or I'm going to have to stand there for 6 hours pretending everything's fine while everyone in that tent decides whether they believe us. I finished the zipper and turned her around by the shoulders, gently, the way you'd steady someone before telling them vitals they didn't want to hear. Then don't perform. Just stand next to me. Let them watch two people who happen to like each other, and let that be boring enough nobody wants to ask questions. She studied my face a second too long, like she was looking for the seam where the performance started and not finding one. You're better at this than you should be. I've had 1.5 years of practice not saying the true thing. Turns out I'm decent at inventing new ways to almost say it. The wedding went off without a single disaster, which felt like a small miracle given everything simmering underneath it. Claire cried through her vows. Simon dropped the ring and caught it against his own shoe in a move that got the biggest laugh of the ceremony. Walter walked his daughter down the aisle, looking like a man trying very hard not to fall apart in front of 100 guests, and mostly succeeding. I sat next to Josie in the second row, her hand tight around mine, and somewhere during the vows she leaned her head against my shoulder like it was the most natural thing in the world, and I let myself, just for the length of one ceremony, stop keeping track of what was real and what wasn't. The reception was on the back lawn, string lights strung between the old maples, the band working through their second slow number of the night. And that's where I lost track of her for about 10 minutes, long enough to duck inside for a shawl Claire had asked me to grab for her grandmother, long enough to pass the side hallway by the kitchen and hear Josie's voice through a half-open door, low and urgent, clearly on the phone. I wasn't trying to listen. I want that on record. But her voice had an edge I recognized, the one from 4 a.m. during hard shifts when everything's about to go sideways, and my feet stopped moving before I told them to. It's not real, Mara. None of it. A pause. My whole chest went still. I need you to remind me of that when this week is over, because I don't think I can keep. Another pause, shorter, and then quieter, almost too quiet to catch. Doesn't even know how much I didn't hear the rest. I didn't wait for the rest. I walked back outside with the shawl still in my hand and told myself it didn't mean what it sounded like it meant, and I didn't believe myself for a second. I found Claire's grandmother, delivered the shawl, made a joke that landed flat even to my own ears, and by the time Josie found me again at the edge of the dance floor, I'd rebuilt the wall brick by brick. The same one I'd been building for 1.5 years before this week tore it down. There you are. She slid her arms around my neck like it was choreographed, like we'd done it 100 times, and maybe in some version of this week we had. Over her shoulder I could see her mother watching us, and Preston beyond her, not dancing, just watching, the way he'd been watching all week. Josie's hand found the back of my neck, her voice dropping low enough it was only for me. Kiss me like you mean it. I felt her breath on my jaw, felt every rehearsed answer I'd prepared for this exact moment go completely out of my head, the way it had the first time I'd imagined this scene, except now there was a hallway and a phone call sitting between us like a locked door. Why? I said, quiet, careful. Because my mother's watching, and Preston's watching, and I'm so tired of performing for both of them, I just want 1 minute where something up here is true. Is that all it is? 1 minute of true? Something in my voice must have carried more than I meant it to, because she pulled back just far enough to actually look at me, confusion cracking through the performance. What's that supposed to mean? I heard you, on the phone, with Mara. Her face moved through about 4 expressions in half a second, landing somewhere between horror and panic. Caleb. It's fine, I said, which was a lie I was apparently good enough at now to tell without flinching. And I stepped back before she could finish whatever she'd been about to say, because I didn't trust myself to still be standing there when it did. I spent the next hour doing what I'm apparently very good at, being useful in a crisis that isn't mine, refilling drinks, herding Claire's younger cousins away from the cake, anything that kept my hands busy and my eyes off the dance floor. Mara found me by the drinks table around 11, arms crossed, studying me like a patient presenting symptoms that didn't add up. You look like a man who heard half a sentence and built an entire building on top of it. I don't know what you're talking about. You're a terrible liar for someone who's spent a week lying professionally. She shook her head, not unkindly. Whatever you think you heard about 10% of it and walked away before the other 90, which, statistically, is not how understanding things works. Then tell me the other 90, not my sentence to finish. She nodded past me toward the dock, where a lone figure sat at the very end, feet hanging over the black water, shoulders curled in on herself in a way I'd never once seen Josie Marsh let herself sit in front of another living person. That one's hers. I walked down slower than I needed to, working out what I'd say and abandoning every version of it before I got there. She didn't turn around when the boards creaked under my weight. I wasn't talking about us. Her voice was rough, like she'd been crying and stopping herself from crying in the specific way people do when they've had a lot of practice. On the phone, I was talking about my mother, the orchard, this whole week feeling like a performance I never signed up for with her watching my every move. I told Mara it wasn't real because none of that's supposed to be my problem to fix, and I needed someone to remind me before I let my mother's guilt make my choices for me again. That's what wasn't real, Caleb. Not you. Never you. She finally turned, eyes rimmed red in the porch light spilling down from the house. The part you didn't stick around for, I was telling her you don't even know how much I need you to be more than this by the end of the week, not less. I sat down next to her, close enough our shoulders touched, and for a second neither of us said a word. She didn't say anything, neither did I. The water made small sounds against the dock posts, patient and unhurried, and somewhere behind us the band was easing into its last set. I've been in love with you for 1.5 years, I said finally, 4 days of practice at saying true things out loud, apparently having worn down whatever used to stop me. Not the ring, not the story about Ferry Street, you. Since about the 3rd week you lived with me, when you fell asleep on my shoulder during that fish documentary, and I didn't move for 2 hours because I didn't want it to end. Josie made a sound half laugh, half something closer to a sob, and pressed her forehead into my shoulder. I have genuinely resented that documentary for 2 years. I thought you found me boring. I found you the opposite of boring. I found you terrifying, actually. In the specific way people get terrifying when loving them is probably going to cost you the easiest friendship you've ever had. And now I think I'd rather lose the easy friendship than keep pretending I don't want the hard, real version of it. She lifted her head, and this time when she looked at me, there was no audience left to perform for. No mother watching from the porch. No Preston counting his losses by the bar. Just the lake, the dock, and 4 days that had turned into something neither of us had planned on surviving intact. "Kiss me like you mean it," she said again, quieter this time, no performance left in it at all. So I did. Walter found out everything 2 days later and just laughed, said the orchard had survived worse than one canceled business hope, and he'd take a happy daughter over a Kessler contract any day of the week. Preston left before brunch on Sunday and never really came up again. I used to think the scariest part of loving someone was saying it out loud. It isn't. The scariest part is the 4 days before that, when you're still telling yourself it's safer to stay quiet, that pretending costs less than meaning it. It doesn't. Pretending costs everything eventually. You just don't notice you're paying until someone hands you a fake ring, and somewhere between a rehearsal dinner and a dock at midnight, it stops being fake without asking your permission first. 8 months later, I was back on that same porch with a real ring in my pocket and 3 weeks of nerve I'd been building up, when Josie came out with 2 mugs of coffee, ink still smudged on the side of her hand from a deadline she'd been fighting all morning. She took one look at my face and set both mugs down on the railing without a word. "You're doing the thing," she said. "Which thing?" The thing where you look like you're about to either propose or tell me someone's coding in the ambulance. Please be the first one." So I got down on one knee on the same boards where she'd once whispered a request I hadn't been ready for, and asked her, for real this time, no rehearsal, no cover story, nothing borrowed and nothing fake. She didn't even let me finish the question. "Yes," she said, already laughing, already crying, already pulling me up by the collar of my shirt. "Yes, obviously, yes, now kiss me like you mean it." So I did,